So we're diving into something big this time. Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
But hold on. We're not just talking about the usual stuff like the hilarious sketches of those iconic moments everyone knows. You know those moments. We're going deeper.
Yeah.
You wanted to explore how SNL, especially back in the 90s, became this massive cultural force. It went way beyond just making people laugh. So that's our mission today.
And it's a really fascinating time to look at because the 90s were such a unique period in America. You had the Berlin Wall coming down the internet, was just starting to become a thing. And there was this really interesting mix of major world events and this huge surge in pop culture. It was like the perfect recipe for satire to take off.
Okay, so imagine this. It's the 90s, you're hanging out with friends, and all of a sudden everybody's throwing out those Wayne's World catchphrases. Party on! Not worthy. It wasn't just a sketch on TV. It was like the show captured this whole slacker attitude of the time.
And that's where SNL's impact becomes really clear. It wasn't just about being funny. They were really capturing a feeling, the feeling of that moment in time, and then reflecting it back to everyone watching in this really clever and insightful way.
And they definitely weren't afraid to touch on politics either. I mean, those impressions Darrell Hammond did as Bill Clinton. And then later, Ben Affleck even gave it a shot. It was uncanny how well they captured his mannerisms, his voice, everything.
It was brilliant satire, and it made politics feel more relatable for a lot of viewers in a way that just watching the news couldn't do. You could be entertained and still get a sense of what was going on politically, even if you weren't following every single policy debate.
And speaking of making politics relatable, we have to mention Weekend Update. For anyone who might not be familiar, that's the part of the show where they do these fake news segments. And let me tell you, that was the way to digest the actual news of the week, at least for me and my friends. It made you feel connected to current events, even if you weren't a total news junkie.
Absolutely. It was social commentary disguised as comedy. Like they took all the anxieties, the frustrations, and even the hopes of the country and turned them into these hilarious bits. And they managed to be entertaining and make you think at the same time.
Totally. I even remember one time there's a sketch, well, I don't want to get too off track, but it sparked this huge debate at a party I was at. People were quoting lines back and forth, arguing about the meaning behind it all because of this SNL sketch. It was wild. It's amazing how SNL could create these conversations that extended way beyond just watching the show.
And that's something that's often overlooked when people talk about SNL's influence. It wasn't just about the individual skits. It was this cultural phenomenon that got people talking, debating, and even feeling a sense of community.
And you can't forget about all the huge stars who got their start on that stage. It was like a comedy boot camp for some of the biggest names in Hollywood.
And that ties directly into how SNL shaped the future of media. Look at a show like The Daily Show, for example. That whole style of mixing humor, satire, and current events, SNL basically wrote the blueprint for that. They created a format that's been incredibly influential.
It really makes you think how a show that aired live on Saturday nights could have such a lasting impact.
Right, and here's where things get even more interesting. Think about how people shared SNL sketches back then.
Yeah.
No social media, no YouTube. It was all word of mouth, maybe a fuzzy VHS tape passed around.
Oh, yeah.
But even without the internet to spread things, those sketches still managed to become part of the conversation.
It's so true. There was no escaping those catchphrases, those characters. It's like they just got stuck in your head. You'd find yourself quoting Wayne's World or Celebrity Jeopardy without even realizing it. Speaking of Celebrity Jeopardy, did you know that sketch was actually inspired by a real celebrity version of Jeopardy that was on TV in the late 90s?
That's right. And it shows how SNL wasn't just reflecting the times. They were also taking inspiration from what was happening in pop culture. But they weren't just doing parodies. They were also ahead of the game in other ways.
Okay. Now you've got me curious. Tell me more. We'll take Charles Barkley hosting, for example. Back then, the idea of a pro athlete hosting SNL was unheard of. Athletes were supposed to stick to sports. But there he was, telling jokes, going all in on the silliness of it all, and he totally owned it. It's like SNL predicted this whole trend of athletes, musicians, actors, everybody crossing over into different areas of entertainment. It was a glimpse of that multi-talented star power we see everywhere today.
Wow. You're totally right. They were like these cultural trendsetters without even realizing it.
Oh.
Okay, but let's be real here. We can't talk about memorable SNL moments without mentioning more cowbell. That sketch is legendary. People still quote it today over 20 years later. It's the perfect example of how SNL could take something simple, add their own brand of humor, and turn it into this huge cultural phenomenon. More cowbell isn't just a funny line anymore. It's like this code word for embracing the ridiculous, for going all out, for adding that extra something special, even if it seems a little over the top.
It's like they captured the crazy energy of the 90s and made it timeless. But, okay, We've talked a lot about the impact, the laughs, the legacy, but there's something else we need to address when it comes to SNL in the 90s.
You're right. Like a lot of institutions back then, SNL wasn't exactly known for being diverse.
Exactly. It wasn't always a perfect reflection of the world we lived in. But that being said, they did make some progress in terms of representation, especially compared to other comedy shows at the time.
Absolutely. And one of the best examples of this is Maya Rudolph. She brought this amazing energy to the show, this fresh perspective, and she quickly became a fan favorite.
She was so funny. It's no wonder she's had such a successful career in movies and TV.
Exactly. And her being on SNL wasn't just about the laughs. It was about breaking down barriers. It showed that there was room for different voices and perspectives in comedy. Her success helped open doors for others to follow.
It's funny how that little detail, Saturday Night Live, that live part, almost didn't happen. Did you know the original name for the show was just Saturday Night?
I did. Can you imagine if they had stuck with that? It doesn't have the same ring to it at all. Adding live brought this energy, this feeling of being right there in the moment that really captured what the show was all about.
Totally. And speaking of capturing the essence, it's like they knew they had to capture that energy, right?
Yeah, that live element, that spontaneity, that feeling that anything could happen. That's a big part of what made SNL so captivating.
For sure.
And when we talk about SNL's legacy, it's not just about remembering those individual sketches or characters. It's about how the show held up a mirror to society, reflecting our hopes, anxieties, the things that obsessed us all through this lens of humor.
Yeah, it's like they were telling us a story about ourselves, even if we didn't always realize it at the time. And back in the 90s, that story was all about rapid change, technology exploding, and all these cultural shifts happening at once.
Exactly. And SNL didn't shy away from any of that. They tackled those topics head on, using satire, wit, even a little bit of absurdity sometimes. And by doing that, they weren't just making us laugh. They were making us think, challenging our assumptions, encouraging us to look at the world a little differently.
And maybe even find some common ground with each other along the way, even if it was just a shared love for Wayne's World or a perfectly timed, more cowbell moment.
Exactly. In a time when things felt really uncertain, SNL gave people this shared experience, this sense of community. It brought people together through laughter. And that's incredibly powerful.
It really is.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Saturday Night Live, I'm curious to know what you think. How do the comedy shows of today measure up? Are they carrying on that legacy reflecting our times just as sharply as SNL did? Or are they doing something totally different, forging a new path? It's something to think about, isn't it?
Absolutely. The world of comedy is always changing, just like everything else. But the impact of SNL, the way it made us laugh and think and connect with each other, that's a legacy that's still with us today.